Hello, I'm Jane from Loopy's Place, and this week I'm in my home sewing room. So today I wanted to talk about seam allowances. I do a lot of community classes, and this time we've got a lot of students that have never sewn before, and it's a great reminder for me to remind me of the things that I've learnt but I've forgotten that I had to learn. It is so easy over time to get familiar with what we're doing. For some people it's like talking another language, but we know what we mean. So one of the things that came up was seam allowances, and I had to explain what a seam allowance was. It was a good reminder for me that not to assume how much people know. So depending on what sort of things that you sew, you'll be familiar with different sorts of sizing. So for me, I do a lot of quilting, so a lot of my seam allowances are 1/4 of an inch, and I tend to spread that around everything that I do. When I'm doing patterns for my classes and beginners, I tend to use the edge of the foot as a guide for seam allowances to make it easier, because not everybody has the specialist feet that I've acquired over time. If you're into dressmaking, it's usually a 5/8 seam allowance, and a lot of patterns that you see will use 1/2 an inch. So we'll just have a look and see what the difference is. First of all, what is a seam allowance? So let's just pick up one of these. A seam allowance is the distance between the edge of the fabric and the stitching through those layers of fabric that are holding it together. So let me get you to have a look closer at these seams. I've just done some samples here. I've done white on black just to make it easier for you to see. This one here is a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and this is what I tend to use for my patchwork and quilting. And to do that, I have a specialist foot. So if I run the edge of the fabric along this line here when I'm stitching, obviously the needle's going to go down there. The distance from the needle to the edge of the fabric is 1/4 of an inch. And having a foot like that means it's an accurate measurement all the way down. So this one here is 1/2 an inch. So a lot of people that write patterns these days would recommend a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so it's a bit easier to remember than 5/8. So you can see the difference in that size. So this one here is a dressmaking seam allowance. That's the 5/8. So from the edge of the fabric to the stitching line is 5/8 of an inch. You can see it's just slightly bigger than the 1/2 inch here. Now, as I said, when I do patterns, I tend to recommend that people use the edge of the foot as a guide. If I take my other foot off my machine, this is my general sewing foot. So when I'm sewing, the needle goes down the middle of the foot. The difference between there to the outside of the foot is this width here. Now, the drawback of this one is that everybody's machine will have a different size foot. Some are wider than that. On one of my machines in the studio, I can get a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance from my general sewing foot. I don't need a piecing foot. Which one you use will be determined by the fabrics, the project that you're making. When you're writing patterns, you need to make sure that, when you're designing, I know I need to remind people when they're making up designs for quilts or cushion covers, when they're cutting out the squares, to allow for that seam allowance, because that really does make a difference across the quilt. So if you're having problems with your projects not coming to the size of the patterns, do check your seam allowance. Sometimes without realising it, we're not keeping that accurate, and also the thread that we use can take up a bit more room, so that will affect the seam allowance as well. As I said, check your patterns, follow the seam allowance that they recommend. I tend to work with the 1/4 inch one, or for other projects where that accuracy isn't essential, I will recommend that my learners use the edge of the foot, just to give them a guide for keeping a straight line, but it's going to be consistent throughout the project. I do hope you found that useful. If you do have any other questions and things that you would like to know, do drop a line and let me know. Make sure you subscribe to my channel. If you hit the bell below, you'll get notifications where new content is added. I look forward to speaking to you very soon. But in the meantime, do take care. Bye.